Good afternoon and welcome to the National Press Club. I'm Mick Rood, a reporter for States News Service and Secretary of the National Press Club Board of Governors. I'd like to welcome my fellow club members and their guests in the audience today, as well as all of you listening to this program over almost 400 national public radio stations or watching on the 3,600 cable systems affiliated with C-SPAN, the Cable Satellite Public Affairs Network. Before introducing the guests at our head table, you should know about some coming events here at the club. Luncheon speakers will include Mstislav Rostropovich, Music Director of the National Symphony Orchestra, next Tuesday, November 6th. Democratic National Committee Chairman Ron Brown and Republican National Committee spokesperson Charlie Black will share the podium for a post-election assessment on Wednesday, November 7th. Lynn Cheney, Chairman of the National Endowment for the Humanities, will be our luncheon speaker on November 14th. And the President of Fox Broadcasting, Jamie Kellner, will address the club on November 16th. I'd also like to remind our guests here today that if you have any questions for our speaker, and I trust you will, please write them on the back of cards provided at your tables and pass them up to me. I will ask as many as I can. Now I'd like to introduce our head table guests and ask them to stand briefly when I read their names. Please withhold applause until I have read all their names. Doug Turner, Washington Bureau Chief of the Buffalo News. Nancy Adler, the daughter-in-law of our speaker. Dr. Vladimir Matyash, Washington Bureau Chief of TASS News Agency. Gil Klein, Media General Newspapers and Vice Chairman of the National Press Club Board of Governors. Mark Adler, son of our speaker. Vera Glasser, Washingtonian Magazine and Chairwoman of the National Press Club Speakers Committee. Drew Von Bergen, a former National Press Club President and Director of Public Relations, National Association of Letter Carriers. Donald Ledwig, President and Chief Executive Officer of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Jacqueline Rose, U.S. General Services Administration, and a member of our Speakers Committee, who organized today's luncheon. Finally, Bruce Russell, Washington Bureau Chief of Reuters. Our speaker today is Mortimer J. Adler, philosopher, teacher, writer, chairman of the Board of Editors of the Encyclopedia Britannica, associate originator and editor with Robert Hutchins of Great Books of the Western World, and director of Chicago's Institute for Philosophical Research. Put simply, Adler is thought by many to be one of the most intelligent people in the United States. Then again, Time Magazine's unforgiving prose had it several years ago that Adler's many critics dismissed him as a hip shooter, the fastest opinion west of the Hudson, but not worthy of serious attention. However those judgments are reached or made, Adler's accomplishments speak for themselves. He did have a rough start in picking a profession. He left high school at the age of 15 to become the secretary of Edward Page, the editor of the New York Sun. After contemplating journalism, he read at age 18 Plato's Dialogues and decided to become a philosopher. At Columbia University, he finished the 4-year program in 3 years, graduating highest in his class. After 5 years of teaching, he earned a PhD in psychology. Adler went to the University of Chicago 60 years ago at Hutchins' invitation to start a, quote, return to classics program at the school, and so began a career of contentious scholarship. Virtually all colleges, in Dr. Adler's opinion, have given up the essential liberal arts core curriculum, which now barely survives in what Adler considers relatively pure form, at a few scattered schools like St. John's College in Maryland, where he has been a visiting lecturer for a number of years. Dr. Adler has been said to find the influence of John Dewey on American thought and education disastrous, and to deplore the pragmatic view that truth is whatever is useful to a given society at a specific stage in its history. Instead, Dr. Adler wrote in the Rotarian, "The fundamental ideals and concepts on which education should be based are universal truths about what constitutes a good education for all men at all times and places, just because they are men. Genuine freedom is so identical with and can be achieved only through discipline. A true liberal education consists in the moral and intellectual disciplines which liberate men by cultivating their specially rational powers to judge freely and exercise free will." Again, Time magazine noted that, according to our speaker, science and other subjects cannot be fully taught without reference to an individual's responsibility to society. The lack of standards of right and wrong, good and bad, the notion that I can't say what a good life is, weakens the essential fibers of democracy. In his book, 6 Great Ideas, he explored the standards of liberty, truth, goodness, beauty, equality, and justice. The book was made into a PBS television series narrated by Bill Moyers. He introduced a teaching program he called paideia, from the Greek word meaning raising a child, to schools in Atlanta, Chicago, and Oakland. When he wrote How to Read a Book, Dr. Adler believed that a smaller portion of Americans were literate in the real meaning of the term than in the 18th century. Dr. Adler has written over 40 books, including How to Think About War and Peace, The Capitalist Manifesto, which he co-authored, The New Capitalists, The Idea of Freedom, Great Ideas from Great Books, The Difference of Man and the Difference It Makes, The American Testament, Reforming Education, and we could go on. We hold these truths. The latter examines the U.S. Constitution and tracks the concept of rightful authority back to the Greek statesman Solon. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in giving a warm press club welcome to our speaker, Dr. Mortimer Adler.
Thank you very much. In fact, you've given half my speech for me. I'm here to talk to you about the controversy about the classics, recent controversy about the classics in our schools and colleges, and to talk about the deplorable state of American education in our schools and colleges. That being the case, it seems appropriate for me to begin with the story of my own education before I tell you what I've tried to do for the education of others. Since I was born in 1902, and I'm now almost 88 years old, it is a long story, part of which has been told, but I will try to tell it as briefly as possible to put the main point of my speech at once. I'm concerned with the fact that only in the last 2 or 3 years has there been any controversy at all about the classics of the Western world. When I get to that point, a little later in the speech, I'm going to try to tell you what is wrong with the present attack on Eurocentrism, academic attacks, and the present insistence on multiculturalism in our schools. Now for my autobiography, told chronologically in a series of dates. I had a very good elementary schooling in New York, public school from 1907 to 1914, at a time, I must tell you, when less than 10% of the children of this country eligible for high school by age were in high school and most of the children left school at the 6th grade, got working papers, and went to work. In 1914, I had to deal with Clinton High School at 12 and a half years of age, and I was a dropout. As the chairman said, I wanted to be a journalist. I was the editor-in-chief of the DeWitt Clinton News, and I had a fight with the principal about who ran the paper. I argued in terms of freedom of the press. It was my job, not his. He won and I lost, and I left. And as the chairman said, I became a secretary to the editor-in-chief of the old New York Sun, a marvelous newspaper. His name was Edward Page Mitchell, by the way, who was a successor to the great editor, Charles Anderson Dana. And as the chairman said, I happened to find a copy of Plato's Dialogues in a volume of the Harvard Classics. The Harvard Classics, by the way, Eliot's 5-foot shelf, was intended not for Harvard students. They didn't read the classics at Harvard. Eliot intended that set to be read by adults after they left college. I must tell you how I happened to find Plato. While I was at Columbia as an undergraduate, the Columbia University Press asked me to do an index of the autobiography of John Stuart Mill, which they were publishing. And I discovered, to my surprise, that John Stuart Mill had his father, James Mill, and Jeremy Bentham taught him Greek in the cradle. He learned Greek by the age of 3. He had read all of Plato's dialogues in Greek by the age of 5. And between 5 and 11, he had read most of the books that I now call the great books, and I had read none of them, not even Plato. And I was 15. So I got Plato out and reading Plato changed my life because I thought Socrates was wonderful, and I wanted to be like Socrates, and decided to go to college. Prepared myself for college and at Columbia at 18. What changed my life really was John Erskine. A name you don't know, perhaps. He was professor of Elizabethan literature at Columbia, and he introduced in 1921 the first great books course in the United States. Not the first in the world, because the background of that course of his, called Classics of the Western World, in Oxford, in the 19th century, the only two tutorials that the students had were called Ancient Greats and Modern Greats. That's where the word great comes from, place of the classics. Ancient Greats, they read the great books of Greece and Rome, modern greats of modern society from the 17th century on. What changed my life was that Erskine invented, and I'm using the word invented very carefully. Before Erskine's time, the only seminars in any universities were in German universities and imitated in the United States by Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and so forth, which were for graduate students only, in fact, only for PhD candidates. There were places where the supervisors of the PhDs met with the students in order to direct their research. That was not Erskine's meaning for the word seminar. A seminar for Erskine was 25 young men, women, sitting around a table, having read the book of that week, and discussing it in an informal fashion. That is a seminar that was first introduced in American colleges by Erskine in 1921, and I was fortunate enough to be in the first class. And when I finished in my senior year, I had made a good enough record to be invited to come back and teach, and graduated in June. I didn't graduate because I didn't ever go to gym, and physical education was required. So Columbia withheld my BA degree, but I was on the faculty the next fall anyway, and taught the great books with Mark Van Doren, the great American poet, from 1923 to 1927. Have such worthies as Clifton Fadiman in my class, Lionel Trilling, various people that you know. And then came the University of Chicago. And let me tell you about that. When Mr. Hutchins, at the age of 29, was appointed president of the University of Chicago, he was dean of the Yale Law School. He came down from Yale the year before he went to Chicago, and we had dinner at the Yale Club in New York. And he said to me, "I'm now the president of a great university, and I never thought about education. Help me. What was the most important thing in your education?" and I said only one thing that I remember of any significance was the course I took with Erskine. We read the great books for 2 years in the seminars. What were the books, said Hutchins. I said, I've got the list in my briefcase downstairs. I went down to the cloakroom and brought it up. Hutchins looked at it and said, with a sigh, I guess I'm an uneducated man. I have a Phi Beta Kappa E from Yale, and I've only read 4 of those authors. That was the state of American education anywhere except Columbia at that time. And Hutchins said, you'll have to come to Chicago and teach with me. You and I will have to teach the great books, because unless I have to teach them, I know my duties as president of the university, my administrative duties will be so great that I won't read them. But if I have to teach them, I will read them, and I'll get an education. So I went to Chicago, and we taught the great books for 15 years together. And then in 1937, Scott Buchanan and Stringfellow Barr came out from the University of Virginia to Chicago, and we worked out a plan for what a liberal education really would be, with the great books at its center, and that led to the establishment of St. John's College in 1937. And Scott Buchanan did 2 things that were remarkable. First place, he took the Erskine list, which was about 50 books, and expanded it to include mathematics and all the great sciences. Before that, Erskine's list was mainly philosophy and literature. Secondly, he did something very courageous. At St. John's College, on the new program that started in 1937, the faculty, there were no professors, no departments of any kind, no professors of any kind. Every member of the faculty was a tutor and fellow of the college, and every member of the faculty had to teach the whole program. No specialists. They had to teach the great books for 4 years, a language tutorial, a math tutorial, and a laboratory tutorial. That was an extraordinary invention. Unless that is done, you have PhDs who are specialists, and liberal education is lost in our colleges. When I've gone around to colleges and tried to tell them what St. John's is like, I often say to them, I know you can't do that. You have to have all your electives, majors and minors, but why don't you introduce one required course of 4 years, which all the students, with all the teachers in the college, read some good books or great books, once a week, once every 2 weeks or 3 weeks or so. And they say, that sounds very nice, Mr. Adler, but what books do you recommend? And I'll read off the list of great books, and they shake their head. Oh, well, we can't do that. Well, why can't you do it? Well, they said, you see, most of those books are not in my field. Think about that for a moment. Most of those books are not. All those college professors with PhDs are narrow specialists. They are not teachers of general education, and they won't read the great books because they think they would lose their authority. Failing to understand that there's no one competent about the great books. I once went down to St. John's College when the faculty was having difficulties and told the faculty, you have to have the courage of your incompetence. For that is what, no one is competent. I've been reading them for 60 years now, and I'm still learning from them and increasing my proficiency. In 1947, at Chicago, Hutchins and I established the Great Books Foundation, which was an agency for spreading the reading of the great books to adults throughout the country, and still going on. And then in 1952, after Mr. Benton, Senator Benton, acquired the Encyclopedia Britannica from Sears Roebuck, he came to Mr. Hutchins and me and said, would you, he couldn't get the books. During the wartime, Every Man Library's edition, modern library editions, Pelican books were not in print. And Benton couldn't stand going to a library, and I think he's right. You can't mock up library books. You can't read without mocking books up. So he said to Hutchins and me, will you publish the set? And Hutchins' reply was, no, I will not. Why not, said Benton. And Hutchins said, because I know you're a salesman and that Britannica can sell them, no doubt about that. The people will buy them, put them on the shelf, there'll be furniture in an American home, and I'm not interested in providing furniture for the American home. Unless there's some way of getting those books off the shelf and people to read them, I don't want to do it. Benton's face fell, and I said, give me 2 weeks, and let me see if I can come up with something to solve this problem. That was 1940, after 43. In 43, I wrote a book called How to Think About War and Peace. And I had an extraordinary experience. In research for that book, I went back to the great books to find passages in them about war and peace. And I found again and again in books that I had read before, Thucydides, Plato, Aristotle, Aquinas, Hegel, Kant, so forth, I found on pages which I had marked passages I'd never seen before. How did I miss them, I said. And the answer was, you mark the passages which where you have a question in mind. I obviously didn't have the question about war and peace in mind when I read these books before. So I said, if you read the books over and over again with every possible question in mind, you could really find out what their content was. That is the origin of the syntopicon. When Hutchins said, yes, that will do it. And Benton said, how much will it cost to do it? And I said, oh, well, how much time? I could do it in 2 years, perhaps $55,000. Ben said, go ahead. 8 years later and $1.5 million later, I produced the Syntopicon, which is a 2-volume index to the great ideas and the great books. And it makes the great books not just a collection of books, but a set of books talking about the same ideas in which the great conversation occurs. In 1964, when I was just 60 years old, I think I could say I really felt for the first time that I was a generally educated man, human being, a generalist as well as a specialist, unlike most of my later contemporaries who are only specialists. And finally, in 1979 and 82, I headed up the Paideia group, which the chairman mentioned. The Paideia proposal was published in 1982, had 2 aims: to make the schools of this country, the public schools of this country, truly democratic schools, giving all the children, the underprivileged as well as the privileged, equal educational opportunity, and really activating their minds by putting seminars in every school for all the students every week from the 3rd grade to the 12th, with readings graded up to the great books at the end. That has been a very successful reform. We have about 125 Paideia schools in the United States, in Chicago, in Chattanooga, in Cincinnati, in the West Coast, in Texas, and so forth. And 2 years ago, the University of North Carolina adopted this, and the National Center for the Paideia program is in North Carolina in Chapel Hill. In all this time, till 1987-98, no one attacked the Eurocentrism of great books of the Western world. The set, when it came out in '52, was almost universally approved by the literary critics and by academic persons. There was not one word of criticism about there being no female authors in the set among the 74 authors, nor about no black authors in the set. There were no complaints about there being no representation of African culture, Hispanic culture, Far Eastern Asian culture. This quarrel and this general and academic acceptance with approval of the great books prevailed not only in 1952, when Great Books of the Western World was first published, but it remained throughout the 70s and the early 80s. The storm first broke at Stanford in 1988, and since then it has spread all over the country, still going on in the press, newspapers and magazines, been filled with many stories about it. I have a fat, overflowing file of those stories. At Stanford, before I attempt to defend the Eurocentrism of great books of the Western world and of the Paideia program's reading list, let me tell you briefly about the irrelevance of what happened at Stanford and elsewhere. At Stanford and elsewhere, the bone of contention was a small core of required authors called classics in survey lecture courses about the history of Western civilization. The reading of the great books was a kind of an addendum to these lecture courses surveying the history of Western civilization. The blacks at Stanford complained about the absence of black authors. The feminists complained about the absence of recent female authors, about the women's movement. The attack was on the presence of only white European males. In little discussion groups that went along with these history courses, how many books do you think were read? 15 at the most. and they finally succeeded in eliminating all but 4. But in striking contrast, how many authors were required reading in the truly great books colleges of this country? At St. John's College, in 4 years, over 125. And similarly in Thomas Aquinas College in California. And in the 2-year great books curriculum in Chicago and Notre Dame, the number was 50 or 60. There is no comparison between the great books program and these survey courses in Western civilization with a few classics read on the side. Most important point is that the great books are not read at all for their historical significance, as if they were archaeological relics of the past. They're only good for their relevance to contemporary life and the basic ideas that we always have to grapple with in order to understand ourselves, our society, and the world in which we live. Now in 1990, we are publishing a second edition of Great Books of the Western World, which I'm the editor-in-chief. I was associated with Hutchins in 1952. First, let me give you a brief statement of the extraordinary changes in that set of books. 60 volumes instead of 54, 130 authors instead of 74, 511 works instead of 443, 13 new translations. The references in this topic are now 85,000 instead of 75,000, and the page count is 37,000 instead of 31,000 pages. Because I want to leave a lot of time for you to ask questions, let me tell you at the end here what our editorial principles for the selection of the authors in the set are. First, the works chosen had to have contemporary significance, relevance to the problems and issues of the 20th century. Secondly, they had to be indefinitely rereadable and restudiable for both profit and pleasure. Their contents could not be understood on 1 or 2 readings. There was more to be found in them on each subsequent reading. Let me comment on that briefly. In the United States now, the count is 40,000 books are published each year. I can say with no fear of exaggeration that not 1,000 of them are worth reading once, carefully. Of that 1,000, I'd say not 100, less than 100 are worth reading twice. Maybe every 4 or 5 years, as a book comes along that's worth reading 3 times, at the most. But the great books are worth reading again and again and again. I've been reading them since 1921. I'm gradually learning. Every time I reread them to teach a seminar, I learn more. They are endlessly rereadable. That's a great difference between contemporary bestsellers and the great books. And finally, the most important criterion is this. The books that we selected had to be relevant, speak significantly about a large number of the great ideas. The Syntopicon has 102 ideas in it, from angel to world. The great issues that have occupied the minds of thinking individuals for the last 25 centuries. Let me now tell you sharply the distinction between a great book and a good book. A great book is relevant to many, many ideas. For example, the Bible, which is not in the set because there's several versions of the Bible, it's in the Syntopicon. The Bible is in all, many topics, of the 3,000 topics, in 102 ideas. Aristotle has 102 ideas. Thomas Aquinas has 102 ideas. Plato, 100. Karl Marx, 97. Freud, 92. All the great books are relevant to at least 25 or more great ideas. Now, good books published from time to time, are relevant to very few ideas. In the Syntopicon, in the 102 chapters, about the 102 great ideas, at the end of each chapter, there's a list of additional readings recommended to the readers of the set. There was a list of good books because they appear in 1 or 2, at the most 3 chapters. A good book will be listed by us for its relevance to 1 or 2 or 3 ideas. The great books are relevant to the whole range of them, or almost the whole range. Two criteria were not employed. It didn't affect our judgments. There are many books that have exerted influence upon human behavior and social change at any time, the time they were written. But they are not great books by these three standards above. We did not include them because of their influence. Just think, Mein Kampf was a very influential book, but hardly great. Uncle Tom's Cabin was a very influential book, but hardly great. Nor did we consider the truth of what the great book said. Maybe this is the hardest point for you to understand. In the great books, there is some truth, but much more error. For every truth, there are many errors. For every truth we know, there are many, many errors. And it's very important to understand the errors well that confront the truth in order to understand the truth it confronts. So don't ever think of the great books as a repository of truth. It's a repository of truth and error, some truth and more error. But that must be understood if you're going to get at the truth in any form at all. Let me summarize this by saying that the great books were not selected on the basis of the author's nationality, religion, gender, politics, or field of study. They were not chosen to make up quotas of any kind. The first two principles, relevance at any time and indefinite rereadability, explain our mission of black authors and of feminist authors who have written good books in recent years. Let me now, in conclusion, anticipate two questions that may be on your minds. I'll be glad to answer any other questions you have when I've finished, but now let me first defend the Eurocentrism of great books of the Western world, and then let me comment on the absence from the set of many very good books written by women and blacks in the 20th century. In the Far East, there are 4 or 5 major cultural traditions. Hinduism, 2 forms of Buddhism, Taoism, Confucianism, and Shintoism. In each of those traditions, there are great books, and those great books are related to one another, and they talk to one another. There's a great conversation going on in each of those traditions, but in those, there's no crossover from one tradition to another. There are 4 or 5 great conversations going on separately in the Far East, none of which engages the authors of the West, as the authors of the West do not talk about the Far Eastern books. Therefore, at the present moment in our cultural life, you have to have these separate conversations. I would like to, you see, I think now technology, physical science, biological science, and mathematics are transcultural. I would like to hope that in the next 2 or 3 centuries, philosophy and religion will become transcultural, and that maybe sometime in 21, 22, 23, those centuries ahead, we will have a set of books called Great Books of the World, in which there's one conversation about the great ideas. Not yet possible. Now the other question. Why have we not included many good and important books written by women and blacks in the 20th century and published before 1955? We used 1955 as the cutoff date, because anything more recent than 1955 is too recent to make a competent judgment about. Let me say we have now added 4 women to the set. In our vision that we had earlier in the century. We've added George Eliot and Jane Austen in the 19th century. We've added Willa Cather and blacking the name, another Virginia Woolf in the 20th century. No blacks. And let me tell you why that's so. Remember what I said about the line that separates great books from good books? Great books are relevant to 25 or more of the great ideas, often more than 50 or 60, and a good book will be found recommended in only 1 or 2 chapters, or 3 at the most. Well, I have here a list of the, here's a list of recent female authors that are in the list of books recommended in the chapters, but not in the great book set. Hannah Arendt, Margaret Atwood, Simone de Beauvoir, Ruth Benedict, Rachel Carson, Marie Curie, Isaac Dinesen, Jane Jacobs, Susan Langer, Doris Lessing, Margaret Mead, Iris Murdoch, Joyce Carol Oates, Flannery O'Connor, Barbara Tuchman, Simone Weil, Eudora Welty, Edith Wharton, all in those reading lists, but they are only relevant to a few of the great ideas. And here are the blacks: James Baldwin, Gwendolyn Brooks, Ralph Ellison, Zora Hurston, Martin Luther King, Toni Morrison, Alice Walker, Richard Wright. Again, recommended in 2 or 3 chapters, but not in the great books. Recommended for those ideas, but only those ideas. That, it seems to me, accounts for what we did, and I think it's a defensible thing. Because in contrast to those good books, very good books, relevant to a few ideas, the books in the set are relevant to a large number. And that is the story. Thank you very much.
Well, let's personalize the problem here. Someone writes, my daughter recently graduated from St. John's College in Annapolis. She can't find a career job. She's working at a Maryland bank for $7.50 an hour. What are the job prospects for liberal arts graduates?
I'm not a vocational advisor, but I tell you a story. At Aspen, I've been teaching seminars at Aspen for the last 30, 40 years. We have chairmen of the board, senior vice presidents, and all of them say that they'd like to hire really liberally educated young men and women. By liberally educated, the St. John's graduates are liberally educated. But who does the hiring? Not the president of the corporation, but the personnel officer. And the personnel officer never talks to the president. The personnel officer has a little niche to fill, and he fills it with someone that's trained for that job. On the other hand, the record of St. John's, I'd like to say to this parent, I've been a member of the St. John's community since 1937. Most of the graduates of St. John's College do succeed in getting very good jobs, and when they get them, they rise much higher in the corporate ranks than the person that fits into a little specialty job. That is, when they find their niche is a big one, not a small one.
Speaking of books, the only contemporary popular book this questioner has read over 5 times is J.R. Tolkien's The Trilogy of the Ring. Have you read it?
Yes.
If so, how
No.
good do you think it is?
It's a good book, but not a great book. And again, if you really index the idea content of that trilogy or those 5 books, it'd be very, very, very light indeed. Very simple test.
Here's a self-serving question from one of our members, I can tell. World Books donates their latest editions to the Press Club Library. Any chance we could get a...
I speak to the chairman of the board.
Any chance we could get a late edition of Britannica? Our 1926 edition has nothing on the Great Depression.
I think that's possible. I'll take that under advisement. Would you like a set of the great books in the library? That I'll do.
This you might expect. What is the greatest book of the 20th century?
I would think the greatest single book of the century is Einstein. It is Einstein, more than Schrödinger, Heisenberg, Bohr, Planck, is the man that changed physical science in the 20th century and our understanding of reality. I can think of no other author in the 20th century, either a literary author, a novelist or a playwright or a scientist, as outstanding as Einstein.
Apparently, the new edition of the great books, and I don't know if this is correct, will include Fitzgerald, Hemingway, and Cather.
Yes.
Do you really think these are in the league with Tolstoy, Melville, and Dostoevsky?
Not quite. Let me say, we were very chary about the 20th century authors, except for people like Einstein and Bohr and Planck, particularly the novelists, even Joyce and Thomas Mann and Proust. We regarded our selection of 20th century authors because we needed them as nominations to be tested in time. Nominations for a set of books we might publish at the end of the 21st century called Great Books of the 20th Century. There are nominations to be judged by, agreed with or disagreed with. Secondly, in many cases, the questions of space prevented us from including the greatest works of these authors. Let me say, for example, we have only one play of Shaw. We have only a short bit of Tawney. In the case of novelists like Proust, we took only Swan's Way, not the whole of Remembrance of Things Past. In the case of Thomas Mann, we didn't take The Magic Mountain, but just a short story, Death in Venice. In the case of James Joyce, we didn't take Ulysses, but only Portrait of the Artist of Young Men. Why? Because if we had taken their long novels, their greatest works, the set would have been 90 volumes long, and I couldn't have given it to you.
I.F. Stone was a member of this club. Do you agree with his conclusion that Socrates was not the great hero we thought he was?
No. I think Stone's theory about Socrates is partly right, partly wrong. But the value of Socrates is not his action at the time of the end of the 5th century, during the Peloponnesian War. It's the dialogues of Plato that are important. And Stone's account of where Socrates stood, along with Plato, on the conservative side of politics, is irrelevant to the wonderful wisdom in the dialogues of Plato.
Well, this is a political town. This question was inevitable. If the White House had a resident philosopher, what advice should he or she give the President Bush to deal with the Persian Gulf crisis?
I'm glad I'm not going to be the resident philosopher. I have no answer to that question.
Well, I'll have to try this one. One of the great books is Machiavelli's The Prince.
Right.
How do you think Machiavelli would make out in Washington today?
In one of President Truman's autobiographical papers, he says something remarkable. He said, the book I read again and again and again is Plutarch's Lives. And the interrogator said, why do you do that, Mr. President? He says, in order to find out what's going on in Washington. Well, if Plutarch's Lives is relevant to what's going on in Washington, certainly Machiavelli is. By the way, in seminars I've conducted about Machiavelli, in which the final insight is that the expedient thing to do, if you want to get power and hold it, is to do whatever is necessary, whether it's moral or immoral. The point is it expedient, not whether it's just and right and sound, good morally. And then I ask, how many presidents of the United States do you think gained and kept power by being Machiavellian? The answer is usually almost all. One or two exceptions. Washington always, sometimes Lincoln, but very few others.
Which are the great books that led to the liberation of Eastern Europe, or was it television?
That's a very hard question. Television is what caused it to spread so rapidly. No question about that. It caused it to spread. I've written a book that's coming out in 1991 March called Haves Without Have-Nots, Essays for the 21st Century on Democracy and Socialism, dedicated to Michael Gorbachev, in which the first essay is the end of the conflict between capitalism and communism. And I think that Karl Marx and Lenin are in part responsible for the error that is made by totalitarian communism, and in part responsible for the rise of socialism. See, I'd like to say this because it's so seldom understood. Most Americans confuse socialism and communism. Communism is the wrong means to socialism. Private property capitalism is the right means to socialism. And what is finally being understood is not that the socialism of a classless society was wrong, but that the Marxian means, the use of state capitalism, state ownership of all the means of production, and a totalitarian government rather than democratic one, is the wrong means to achieve the good of socialism.
Turning to what I would guess would be pure philosophy, is it essentially correct to say that you summarize happiness as the culmination of a human life well lived in accordance with certain precepts, etc., you've spelled out in your writings? If so, is happiness, in this sense, essentially the same as defined by Abe Maslow in the fully self-realized individual, as the fully self-realized individual at the apex of his hierarchy of needs? Are there significant differences?
Well, Mr. Maslow didn't invent the hierarchy of needs. The conception of happiness that is implicit and borrowed by Maslow from Aristotle, you give you the definition. Happiness consists of a whole life, well lived, in which all real goods are successfully achieved and the real goods are the goods we need, accompanied by a moderate possession of wealth and other external goods, and lived in accordance with virtue. That happiness is something you can't experience. Anyone who thinks says I've been happy, last year I was very happy, I'm now unhappy, or Happy New Year, or Happy Thanksgiving, or that's a misuse of the word happiness, or a totally different use. In the modern world, happiness is confused with contentment, a purely psychological conception of happiness, of getting what you want. Now, the distinction, which Mr. Maslow doesn't make clearly, doesn't understand clearly enough, in Aristotle, is between wants and needs, between natural desires and acquired desires. And real goods are the things we need. The things we want are only apparent goods. And since this is a whole life well lived, you never experience it. The only person that can say he was a happy man or woman is the man who preaches at your funeral.
This question could burn up the rest of the program, but many people ask a similar one, so here it is. Have you a religious faith? If so, which one and why?
Personal questions I don't answer.
Thank you. But many ask. Why did you get your PhD in psychology when you wanted to become a philosopher? What was the subject of your dissertation?
I did want to come. I fought with John Dewey in 1920. He had just come back from China, where he really installed on the Sun Yat-sen a reformed educational system. I was one of his first students at Columbia, and he was a pragmatist, and at that point I disagreed with him quite violently, and in several papers that I read before the Philosophy Club, angered him considerably. And so the job I wanted in the philosophy department was denied me because John Dewey was the king and I was the serf. I went to the next best thing was psychology, which I would punish for my sins by having to teach it. And you'll never believe what the subject of my dissertation was. It was an experimental approach to the appreciation of music. It was published in psychological monographs, and I would like no one to read it. That's true of all PhD dissertations.
And that's the name of that tune. What do you think of William Buckley's recommendation that every young American give a year to public service?
Entirely in favor. Entirely in favor. In fact, I talked with Buckley about this in various programs I've been with. The one plank in the Paideia program that I could not get my college to accept was this. I wanted to have graduation schools, kindergarten at age 3 for advanced learning, young learning. Grade 1 elementary, grade 1 at age 4. Graduation from high school at age 16, not 18. And then compulsory non-schooling for all children. 2 years out of school. Have them grow up. They can't grow up. No one grows up in school. So that when they get to college, if they go to college, they're more adult than they are now. And in those 2 years, I wanted to have them either in the public or the private sector, and in the public sector in public service. But the difficulties with the labor unions on that point, the difficulties economically are very great, but I think it's a very sound idea. If you go from high school to college, you lose the joy of learning. Those who have worked for 2 years, have other experiences, grow up, go back to school, will be much better students than will be under any other conditions.
What was it like to put your ideas onto a television series, The 6 Great Ideas, with Bill Moyers?
Well, Bill Moyers is a marvelous interviewer. He unlike many interviewers, he really read the book before he asked questions. And Moyers has one great talent. Let me say this, I know he's going to be here in a few weeks. He asks the person he's interviewing questions that he thinks the public would like to ask. So it's something he represents them and gets out from the author he's interviewing the kind of questions the public want to hear. He's a very good interviewer. It was a very, very successful series. It was done about 10 years ago, and it's been replayed on PBS again and again and again.
Congress appropriated millions to create a Department of Peace.
Is there a Department of Peace?
There is. Can peace be attained by bureaucratic meetings?
Well, first, is there a Department of Peace?
Institute is the right word.
No.
But regardless.
No, the answer is no. But by the way, one of the great ideas is peace, and generally misunderstood. I'd wager that most of the people in this room think that peace now exists in the world because, apart from the conflagration at the Persian Gulf, most of the great nations of the world are not fighting with one another. There's no peace between the United States and Canada because peace is negatively defined as the absence of fighting. Even among friendly nations, it's not peace. Peace consists of that condition in which all disputes can be settled by law and dialogue, not by force. There's civil peace in Washington, civil peace in Maryland, civil peace in the United States, but no peace between England and the United States, no peace between the Cold War. The Cold War is the condition of peace in which though unfriendly, hostile nations are not at that moment fighting, though they always can use force to settle. They had no other. I assure you that if the United States and Canada, as well as the United States and the USSR, had really serious conflicts, and they couldn't be settled by diplomacy of any kind, they would resort to force. So the peace consists, positively understood, civil peace is that condition in which all disputes can be settled without resort to force. It doesn't exist in the world, and it will not exist until we have world government.
As concisely as you're able, what is your opinion of William James' place as philosopher in the 20th century?
He's in the set twice. He's in the set for the great book, the book he wrote in 1894 called The Principles of Psychology, and for the great lectures he gave at Columbia called Pragmatism. One of the best in the 20th century.
You touched on this briefly in your address, but could you tell us a little more about the liberal arts curriculum at St. John's? What makes it so outstanding?
Well, I think I've already told you that. 4 years of reading the great books, 2 seminars a week on Monday and Tuesday and Thursday night. Only 1 lecture a week given to the college as a whole. I've been lecturing at St. John's since 1937, and the lecturers are either members of the faculty teaching a general subject or invited outsiders, and then tutorials in foreign language, tutorials in mathematics, tutorials in laboratory science. And when some difficult books are read slowly, not as they are in seminars, they're called preceptorials. That is really, that's the essence of a liberal education. St. John's has it, Thomas Aquinas College has it, the full 4 years. Notre Dame has it for 2 years, St. Mary's College has it for 2 years, and no other college has it at all.
One last question before the end of our program, and then I want to present something to you. Have you ever regretted your decision as a teenager to become a philosopher or psychologist instead of a journalist? Instead of a journalist, remember where you are.
No. Sorry, my friend, never.
We'd like to present you with this certificate of appreciation and a National Press Club mug. May it always be full.
Beer?
Right over here. Thank you very much.
Thank you.